All right, hello and welcome everybody to another episode of The Big Three on CPA TV. My name is Mihir Torsekar, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and fellow economist at CPA, Andrew Rechenberg. And together we're going to talk to you all about the big three trade topics happening this week. But before we get into the show itself, we do what we always do, which is give you a real quick rundown of the three topics that we're going to be talking about today. So the first item on the agenda is to talk about the latest report from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, which has been making the rounds on a lot of the social media platforms. And it's largely because their signature finding was that after looking through 150 years of U.S. history and then comparing the results with, other industrialized economies, the UK, France, for example, they found that tariffs actually not only do not raise inflation, but they actually prove to be disinflationary, that they actually lower inflation. So that was something that we wanted to talk to you all about today, about what our general thoughts are and what that means for our kind of what we talk about at CPA when it comes to tariffs. And then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to give you a preview about the second and third topics on the agenda today.
For the second topic today, we have the U.S. trade deficit narrowing and the U.S. trade data report for August 2025. In August, the goods and services trade deficit fell to around $59 billion in August, down from about $78 billion in July. And this is a sharp decrease by about 34%. And so this is a significant improvement in our trade deficits. And this is mostly brought about by a reduction in imports. Exports rose slightly to about $280 billion, while imports fell very significantly to about $340 billion. And that's a $18 billion drop in imports, including a mostly big decline in industrial supply imports. And this is the exact kind of shift that tariffs in the U.S. are starting to cause. And importantly, this is not causing inflation. For example, in August, the inflation for non-fuel imports was only 0.4%, while overall inflation was nearly 3%, showing that most of the cause of inflation is actually coming from elsewhere, such as housing, food, and energy. And then for the third topic this week, we have the Trump administration's tariff rollbacks and comments on food inflation. The Trump administration just announced a number of tariff rollbacks, especially on food products, after reaching trade deals with Argentina, Ecuador, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And this move has been largely misguided. And this is really just a false idea that these imports are going to lower costs coming into the U.S. For example, the food costs in the U.S. that are really rising, beef, chicken, poultry, produce products, these prices were rising well before tariffs were actually impacted, especially for things like eggs. And it's usually always caused by changes and reductions in domestic supply, either with beef over the long term, we have the smallest cattle herd since 1951, or with disruptions in U.S. chicken supply, such as with the avian flu in 2024 that really kicked off before any of these tariffs happened. Overall, the main problem with this is not tariffs, but a lack of U.S. supply. 2024 was the worst trade deficit year in our history for agriculture, and we've gone from a net exporter of food, the breadbasket of the world, to a net importer.
So the first item on the agenda today is to talk about a recent paper that came out in the past week or so from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. And they found that when they looked at a history of 150 years throughout the United States economic policy and then compared it with a shorter time frame, but nevertheless a robust data set, when they looked at the UK and France, they found that the imposition of tariffs were actually not associated with an increase in inflation, but actually were proved disinflationary, that they actually lowered inflation. I don't want to get into too much of the specifics about the paper itself, but I think that, my takeaway is that the signature argument that has been advanced by a lot of the mainstream voices in the media and a lot of the mainstream economists that we hear from is that tariffs are automatically inflationary. And it occurs to me that as we're struggling with, I think the United States is struggling with a cost of living crisis, and there's a lot of concerns about how things like the cost of food is increasing, the cost of housing is increasing, healthcare expenses are rising, things like that, that it's very easy for a lot of folks to point the finger at the tariff boogeyman, if you will, the tariff derangement syndrome that we hear a lot about. And I think a study like this just provides you with one data point to kind of put in the other column and to say that, because I'm not going to sit here and tell you all that, and CPA is not going to sit there and tell you all that tariffs are, don't cause inflation, or excuse me, are disinflationary. We're not going to say that they lower inflation necessarily. There's a lot to be, unpacked with this study, but it's simply to just add another data point, add some nuance to this discussion, and to say that, the headline argument that's being made is not necessarily the correct one. But Andrew, if you wanted to hop in, go ahead and tell us what you think about this.
Yeah, I think that this Fed study really replicates a lot of the results that we saw in previous studies from the U.S. federal government. For example, the Boston Fed had a study that came out this past February. The Congressional Budget Office had a report that came out last December looking at some of these projected impacts from tariffs. And they're all basically saying the same thing, that tariffs do have a very, very mild inflationary impact, but this is a fraction of what is normally projected by a lot of the mainstream economists and a lot of the naysayers. And specifically to look at numbers, the Boston Fed in February projected that a 10% global tariff would result in inflation in the US of less than 1%. And so this is a much, much, much lower increase than what most people assume, that if you have a 10% tariff, you could have 10% higher prices. And what we're seeing with all these economic reports is that it's nowhere close to that. You are going to have a very slight increase in prices, and that's natural. You're almost trying to make some sort of price change to help out U.S. domestic producers. But at the grocery store or at the supermarket for these tariff-related goods, it's a very, very marginal increase in costs. But I also think it's important to point out that that's not to say that costs aren't rising in the U.S. And it's very obvious costs are, and I would never say that they aren't. But the link between these price rising and tariffs really does not exist. If you look at all the big sectors where costs are rising, it's electricity, which is largely due to increased AI demand, housing, which is caused by us not building enough housing, zoning issues, a lot of issues like that, and food. But even when you look at food, this is one sector that people have been typically associating with imports. This also isn't a strong link, because when you look at food, most of our imported food comes from Mexico and Canada. And these are two countries that have had no tariffs because of USMCA. And so what's really happening here is we're really seeing a broad economic narrative that's dispelling that tariffs are making this big impact on prices.
Yeah, and I think that leads us nicely into the second topic, that talking about. Well, I can't recall if you felt more comfortable, maybe we go second topic today. We talk about the food, imports that we've just lifted on food prices, and it strikes me as relevant because when we talk about the pass-through effect that you mentioned, and a lot of the folks are saying, well, if you apply 10% tariffs, it's going to be a 10% sticker price all across everything, right? But I think it often that depends, and there's a lot of nuance here, like with everything. But if for something like coffee, where we don't have regular substitutes for that, we don't have coffee, farms, we don't have a robust coffee industry, as it were. So yeah, we're going to feel the effects of that tariff. It's going to be passed through more directly. And so maybe lifting the tariff or not even applying a tariff on coffee, you're probably going to see more of an effect on the sticker price. But I think you've done some great research, especially in the beef sector as well, and actually have found that the opening of markets and flooding the markets, U.S. market with imports of beef, for example, have actually had the opposite effect and really decimated our ranchers and our cattle herds to the point where we've actually seen supply shortages in the United States. And that is the exact opposite of what you want to bring down prices. So why don't you talk a little bit about that second topic, maybe about like the decision to kind of lift tariffs and welcome more imports on food as a tactic to try to bring down prices.
Yeah, so the Trump administration has recently announced trade agreements with countries like Argentina, Ecuador, Guatemala, and El Salvador in order to eliminate tariffs on various food products coming into those countries to try to reduce U.S. grocery store prices. But there are really two main problems here. The number one is that this is really a misguided approach. Number one, because when you look at the food that most Americans are consuming, it's mostly either made here in the U.S., and so the domestic supply actually matters the most, Or when it is imported, it comes from the top two countries that are Mexico and Canada. Even if you go down and look at the next couple countries, these are starting to get into countries like Italy or France or Ireland, who are some of our next biggest import countries for food. These are none of the countries we're talking about. Argentina, Ecuador, Guatemala, El Salvador, these countries don't even rank in the top 10 for our food imports. So this really is just maybe a bit of a publicity stunt, and it's not really something that impacts food prices. Tariffs are not having a big impact here. And it's also important to separate out into two separate categories that we can have with food. So, for example, if you take something like coffee, where we really don't make this in the US, that does have a lot more higher of association for potential price increases whenever we import it, because we don't have this domestic base that we can go back on. It's really just an import-dependent product due to the nature of how it's made. But these are more specialty products, tropical goods, coffee, stuff like that. For most products, like things like you would see at any local U.S. farm, like beef or eggs, chicken, different fruits and vegetables. These are all areas that we used to have a huge trade surplus in. As late as the 1970s, 1980s, we had a food surplus in both fresh fruits and fresh vegetables, but not anymore. Now we have some of the largest trade deficits in our history with food, and we were once the breadbasket of the world. So really the big problem that we're getting back to here is the lack of domestic supply. We're having a record low domestic production because what we've essentially done is we've sacrificed all of our main agricultural sectors, such as beef, poultry, fruits, vegetables, a lot of these different areas for these very, very specific export sectors. So we make these deals to allow in a bunch of beef, chicken, things that people actually eat every day. And we're really subsidizing and encouraging exports for only a very few sectors. Corn, soybeans, wheat, these sectors, they can maybe export a little bit more, but all of our other local farmers suffer. And it just, again, leads to more concentration and more market power in the hands of these very few companies. And so what we really need is more domestic production. And it's important to note that the prices for these grocery store items started rising long before the 2025 tariffs, especially if you think of egg prices in 2024. Beef prices started increasing well before any of these tariffs happened, and most of our imports still aren't tariffed. Prices are rising, but it's important to point out the right culprits in here and what we can actually do to lower these prices moving forward.
Yeah, and again, it's worth remembering too that I think trade, if I'm not mistaken, either it's imports or trade in general, about 11% of the economy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but therefore, the items that are tariffed have at most a marginal or a fraction of the impact on the overall economy, the economic health. So it's also worth putting in perspective where, trade and traded items come into the whole economic picture. It's a much broader canvas to be, that we're painting this picture on. So, yeah, go ahead. And I think that segues nicely into talking a little bit about the latest release of the economic data that you've had a chance to look through, and let's hear your thoughts on what you think about that.
Yeah, so after a little bit of a delay, we finally got the August trade data figures, and the main headline here is that the trade deficit is decreasing, down by about 24% month to month from July into August. And so this is a beginning look at what some of the tariff impacts have been for the U.S. And so we are seeing a reducing trade deficit, especially with the tariff front loading that we saw in the beginning of the year, where importers were importing a lot of different products before these tariffs came into effect. And now we're seeing that deficit drop. And so it's still a little early to tell whether this is just a little bit of that inventory taking into account, or whether this is the first signs of trade policy actually lowering the trade deficit. But I do think it's important to note that with these reductions in the trade deficit, this is a little bit of a step in the right direction at best, but it's by no means a solve of a problem. We still have a lot of problems with a lot of different sectors. The tariffs have been applied at a very broad range, where we still need a lot of sector-by-sector tariffs to protect specific industries in the U.S. And that's a far more effective approach at identifying what are the critical industries in the U.S. we need to have here and we can have here, versus having more of these broad tariffs that are a little bit more, they're a little less specific to these industries. And so it is potentially a good sign, but it's far from sufficient for what a lot of our producers need.
Yeah, I like the way that you dropped the word specific in, because that gets me thinking about, how we move to the 232 framework, and how, again, at CPA we've been pounding the drum on this issue, that it allows us to be more tactical and surgical and precise in how we target, specific sectors, specific product categories, and we just have the whole complement of tools, whether it's compound tariffs or specific tariff, ad valorem tariffs. Like, we can apply that framework in a much more tactical manner and get the kind of relief that we need for the specific sectors that we have, as opposed to this sort of, approach that's almost scattershot, or, I'm just going to apply blanket ad valorem tariffs, 10%, 50% across this product category to this country, and then I'm going to change it. And, you just need that stability. You need something to just hang your hat on. And I think what concerns me, and this is frankly where it's a little tough to understand and come down hard one way or another on what the data is telling us, because there is still a lot up in the air. What's the status of the IEEPA tariffs? Which direction are we going to go? What is the final shakeout of the 232 tariffs? Now, we have like 12 investigations. The last I checked, we might have more in the pipeline. I'm sure we do. So, again, it's hard to just hang your head on any one particular data point. I still think that there's a lot of noise in the story. But to your point, I think, we're encouraged by the fact that, yes, one of the main goals of the tariff policy in the first place is to lower the trade deficit. And anytime we can see something like that, we'd like to think that, we'd like to see more of that. And we'd like to see that, we like to think that that's a step in the right direction. So, again, lots more to uncover over the next couple of months. And certainly this is the place where I think for folks to be able to come and find out, what we think about that, what CPA's research is showing. So, that's great topics as always, Andrew. Thank you for joining me as always. Next week, we're actually going to be off. Happy holidays, happy Thanksgiving to you and your families. We'll be back the following week to then talk about the big three items in trade, where I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about. So thank you for joining us. Take care.